Donora, Pennsylvania, October 1909. The air, already thick with the metallic tang of the steel mill and the sulphurous promise of the coal yards, carried a new scent up the muddy slope of the company housing hill. The smell of wet earth. On a small plot scraped from the hillside, Stoyan Petkov was doing something that made the other steel workers stop, stare, and then laugh. He was covering his house in mud. It wasn't just any house. Petkov, a recent arrival from Bulgaria, had built a steep-sided A-frame, little more than a simple wooden tent, its rafters meeting at a sharp peak 18 feet high. This was odd enough in a town of slapdash saltbox shanties, but what he was doing now beggared belief. With his wife Elena and two small children, Boris and Raina, he was mixing a thick slurry of clay dug from the creek bed with chopped straw from the livery. Then, bucket by bucket, handful by handful, he was plastering it onto the pitched roof of the A-frame. Not a thin daub to seal cracks, but a massive, accumulating layer. Pierce Yardley, the foreman of the Donora steel coal yard, stood with a knot of off-shift workers, his arms crossed. Yardley was a man whose world was measured in tons and BTUs, in the black, angular reality of coal. He understood structural integrity. He understood gravity. "What in God's name is that fool Bulgarian doing?" a Welshman named Jones muttered, spitting tobacco juice. Yardley shook his head, a grim smile on his lips. "He's building himself a mudslide. Is what? I give it till the first hard frost. That much weight, soaking wet on that pitch. The whole mess is going to heave, sag, and come down on their heads by April. They'll be sleeping under a pile of wet straw." He projected his voice, a foreman's accustomed boom. "Petkov, you trying to bury your family before the winter does?" The men laughed. The structure already looked bizarre, less like a cabin and more like a primitive earthen mound, a squat, lumpy pyramid taking shape against the gray sky. The layer of clay straw, or cob as Petkov called it, was already a foot thick and growing. Stoyan, a quiet man with powerful shoulders and hands permanently stained by some combination of soot and earth, paused his work. He looked at Yardley, then at the thick, dripping wall of mud he was building. He said nothing, simply turned back to his work, plunging his hands back into the wheelbarrow of slurry. The quiet dismissal was more insulting to the onlookers than any angry retort. They called him mad. They called him the Mud King of Donora. The mockery was relentless, a daily ritual for the men trudging up the hill from the mill. What did this Bulgarian Kirpik maker from the sun-baked plains of Plovdiv understand about pitched-face thermal mass that the experienced, practical men of the Allegheny steel country had so completely missed? I promise you, if you stay with me, you will understand not only the physics that made Stoyan Petkov's strange mud pyramid a fortress of warmth, but also a deeper principle about how old knowledge can solve new problems in the most unexpected ways. Before we go on, take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss other stories of forgotten ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen someone use? Stoyan Petkov was not a carpenter, he was not a miner, and he was certainly not a frontiersman, accustomed to the raw, damp cold of a Pennsylvania winter. In his homeland, along the Maritsa River, he was a master kirpich maker. His life had been one of clay, straw, water, and sun. His hands knew the precise feel of clay at the right moisture content, the exact amount of straw needed to give an adobe brick tensile strength. He understood the slow, patient craft of turning mud into shelter, of building kilns whose thick earthen walls could hold a searing heat for days. He understood mass. This knowledge had been of no use during his family's first winter in Donora. They had been assigned a standard company shanty, a single-walled box of green, unseasoned pine planks nailed to a flimsy frame. It was a sieve for wind and a sponge for damp. The money Stoyan earned at the mill, a crushing 12 hours a day wrestling hot steel, was almost entirely consumed by the company store and the endless, ravenous appetite of their small cast-iron stove for company-owned coal. That first winter had been a lesson in a different kind of physics, the physics of suffering. Elena, his wife, had tried to make the place a home, but the cold was a relentless intruder. It was a living thing. They had watched a new boiler tin, set in the smokehouse to cure bacon, crack clean in half on its hot side from the thermal shock of the frigid air hitting the other. The kitchen broom left by the door grew so brittle that its bristles snapped with a sound like breaking icicles every time Elena swept. The most haunting memory for Stoyan was the jar of molasses. One January morning, he'd gone to pour some on his children's breakfast, only to find the thick, dark syrup had grown a clear, solid rind of ice inside the jar, on the shelf in the warm kitchen. His children, Boris and Raina, were constantly sick, their small bodies racked with coughs that echoed in the cold, drafty room. They slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket the family owned, and still they shivered. Stoyan saw the look in Elena's eyes, a quiet, desperate fear that he recognized from tales of starving winters in the old country. He had failed them. His strength, his labor, his wages, none of it was enough to defeat this American cold. He vowed it would not happen again. He would not fight the cold on its own terms with thin walls and a fire that burned too fast. He would fight it with what he knew. He would fight it with mud. The failure of the conventional cabins in Donora was simple and brutal. They were designed for speed of construction and maximization of profit for the steel company, not for human comfort. A typical shanty was a single layer of 1-inch pine boards. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance, was barely 1. Heat, which always moves to cold, had 3 primary escape routes. First was conduction. The moment a BTU of heat was generated by the stove, it warmed the interior air, which warmed the inner surface of the pine boards. That heat energy was then conducted directly through the wood to the outside, where it was stripped away by the wind. A pine board has an R value of about 1.25 per inch. A single wall was a thermal highway for heat loss. Second was infiltration. The green wood used for construction shrank as it dried, opening up countless gaps between the boards, around the single-pane windows, and under the doors. On a windy day, you could feel a dozen tiny, vicious drafts knifing through the room. These drafts were not just uncomfortable, they were a disaster for fuel efficiency. Every cubic foot of warm air pushed out by the wind had to be replaced by a cubic foot of freezing air pulled in, which then had to be heated by the stove. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The families of Seamus Riley and Evan Jones, neighbors on either side, burned through their coal ration by the 20th of each month and were forced to scavenge, or worse, burn their own furniture to stay warm. Third was the failure of radiant heat. The small iron stoves got red hot, radiating warmth in all directions. But in a room with freezing cold wall surfaces, a person's body would radiate its own heat towards those cold walls, making them feel chilled even if the air temperature was tolerable. Your back would be freezing while your face was roasting. It was an exhausting, unhealthy way to live. The fire burned hot and fast, consuming fuel at an alarming rate, but the structure itself held no warmth. The moment the fire died down, the cabin's temperature would plummet to match the outside within an hour. The mockery directed at Stoyan was rooted in this reality. To the men of Donora, a house was a wooden shell you kept warm, with a big, continuous fire. The idea of the house itself being the source of warmth was utterly alien. The construction of Stoyan's mud pyramid began in late summer. First, the A-frame itself. He used heavy, rough-sawn timbers for the rafters, spaced closer together than normal, understanding the immense load they would soon have to bear. The structure was simple, a floor, and two massive sloping walls that also served as the roof. This design was crucial. An A-frame exposes almost double the interior wall area to the living space compared to a conventional cabin with a flat ceiling. For Stoyan's plan, this was not a bug. It was the central feature. Then came the mud. He found a vein of heavy gray clay in the bank of the Monongahela River, a mile's walk from his plot. He and Elena would haul it back in burlap sacks, a back-breaking labor after his shifts at the mill. The children, Boris and Raina, had the job of gathering straw from the fields beyond the town, and their small bare feet were the primary mixing tools. They dumped the clay, straw, and water into a shallow pit lined with canvas, and the whole family would stomp and dance until the mixture was the perfect consistency. Not too wet, not too dry. The straw fibers distributed evenly throughout the clay. Stoyan would check it with his hands, a gesture so practiced it seemed instinctual, the same way he would have tested the Kirpich mix back in Plovdiv. He applied the cob in lifts, horizontal courses about 2 feet high. He'd pack the thick, heavy mud against the wooden sheathing of the A-frame, tamping it down, working it in with his bare hands until it was a solid, monolithic mass. He started at the bottom, building a base that was a full 36 inches thick on the southern-facing pitch, battered like an ancient fortress wall. Each lift had to dry for a few days before the next could be applied, a slow, patient process that stretched through September and into the golden light of October. The mockery was constant. Pierce Yardley made a point of stopping by each evening. "Still at it, Petkov?" he'd call out. "That wall's starting to look a bit heavy. You sure your rafters can take it when the frost gets in there and swells it up?" This was Yardley's core objection, and it was a professional one. He'd seen what frost heave could do to retaining walls in the coal yard, how it could buckle steel and crack stone. The idea of 24 inches of what was essentially wet dirt hanging on a pitched roof seemed like a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. "It's gonna slough, Stoyan," he'd say, using the man's first name in a tone of feigned concern. "The whole south face will peel off like a scab in the spring thaw. You'll be lucky if it doesn't take the whole frame with it." Stoyan would just nod, wiping sweat and clay from his brow. "It will hold," he said one day, his only reply in a week of taunts. His wife, Elena, was more pragmatic. "It looks like a giant loaf of bread, Stoyan," she'd said, her hands on her hips, a smile playing on her lips. But there was no fear in her eyes, only trust. She had seen the kilns he built in the old country, had felt their residual heat warming their small home long after the fire was out. She trusted his hands. As the final layer went on, Stoyan performed the last crucial steps. He troweled the entire surface smooth, creating a seamless, monolithic skin. Then, as the clay was leather hard, he took pieces of broken glass and burnished the surface, rubbing it for hours until it developed a slick, semi-glossy sheen. This was not for aesthetics. The burnishing compacted the outer layer of clay particles, creating a hard, water-resistant shell that would shed rain and snow. The mud pyramid was complete. It sat on the hillside, a strange, silent rebuke to the flimsy wooden boxes that surrounded it. It had no windows on its pitched faces, only a small door and a few windows on the vertical end walls. To his neighbors, it looked like a tomb. To understand why Stoyan's mud pyramid was not a tomb, but a revolutionary heat engine, you have to understand the difference between insulation and thermal mass. The men of Donora understood insulation, at least instinctively. They knew a thicker coat was warmer than a thin one. Insulation works by trapping air and slowing the transfer of heat. Its goal is to create a barrier. Thermal mass works on a completely different principle. Its goal is not to stop heat, but to absorb it, store it, and release it slowly over time. Think of a black stone sitting in the sun. It gets hot, and long after the sun goes down, it continues to radiate that heat. Stoyan Petkov had not built a wall, he had built a stone, a massive 24-inch thick stone made of mud. Let's look at the numbers. The cob mixture Stoyan used had a density of approximately 105 pounds per cubic foot. A single foot-long slice of his 18-foot high-pitched wall, 24 inches thick, contained about 3,780 pounds of material. It was a staggering amount of weight, which is why Yardley's concern about structural integrity was so logical. But Stoyan was not a carpenter. He was a kirpich maker. He understood mass. The specific heat of his clay straw mix was about 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means it took 0.22 BTUs of energy to raise 1 pound of his cob by 1 degree. With this, we can calculate the storage capacity. To raise that 3,780-pound slice of wall by just 20 degrees Fahrenheit, say from 50 degrees to 70 degrees, it had to absorb over 16,600 BTUs of heat. An entire wall, 60 feet long, had the capacity to store millions of BTUs. This is where the A-frame design was genius. The small stove inside the cabin would run during the day. The heat it produced would rise, just as in any other cabin. But instead of hitting a thin ceiling and escaping, it hit the vast, sloping interior face of the cob wall. For hours and hours, the stove wasn't just heating the air, it was charging the wall, pouring thousands of BTUs into the dense clay. The heat didn't pass through quickly. The thermal conductivity of cob is low. It took many hours for the heat to slowly soak through the 24-inch thickness. By the time the fire in the stove was banked for the night, the inner surface of the wall was warm to the touch. And for the next 36 hours, that stored heat would continue its slow journey, eventually reaching the interior surface again, but this time radiating downward onto the family sleeping below. The wall itself had become a giant, slow-burning radiator. Stoyan hadn't just built a house. He had built a battery for heat. The winter of 1909-1910 arrived with a savage fury. In early January, a high-pressure system settled over the Allegheny Mountains, clamping down like a lid on a pot. It created a brutal temperature inversion. The air in the valleys, already colder, grew stagnant. For 11 straight days, the temperature in Donora never rose above 20 degrees, and at night it plunged to a soul-crushing 28 degrees. Worse than the cold was the smoke. The inversion trapped the ceaseless output of the Donora steel mill, the zinc works, and the thousands of coal-burning home chimneys at the valley floor. A thick, yellow, acrid fog descended, so dense it blotted out the sun. The sky was a permanent, greasy twilight. The sun never reached the flues of the cabins on the lower slopes. The air was a toxic soup that burned the lungs and stung the eyes. For the families in the conventional shanties, it was a living hell. The cold was an invading army. It found every crack. Water buckets froze solid indoors. Men came home from the mill to find their wives and children huddled around stoves glowing cherry red. Yet the corners of the room were rimed with frost. The Riley family burned their kitchen table. The Jones family's youngest child developed a pneumonia that left him gasping for every breath. The air inside their cabins was a frantic cycle of superheated air near the stove and Arctic drafts everywhere else. In the Petkov pyramid, life was different. It was quiet. The small stove was fired up in the morning, and for a few hours it burned steadily, consuming a fraction of the coal their neighbors used. By noon, Stoyan would bank the fire. And then, silence. No frantic feeding of the stove, no roaring fire. Outside, the world was a frozen, toxic landscape. Inside, a gentle, pervasive warmth radiated from the massive, sloping walls. Elena could leave a bowl of water on the floor, and it would not freeze. The children, Boris and Raina, could play in their shirt sleeves on the wooden planks, their coughs long since vanished. The air was still and calm. There were no drafts because the monolithic cob shell had no cracks. The temperature hovered at a steady, comfortable 68 degrees, day and night. The ultimate proof, the detail that captured the impossible normalcy of their lives, sat on a small shelf built into the inner south pitch wall. It was a simple earthenware pot, covered with a linen cloth. Inside, milk and a spoonful of starter were slowly, magically, transforming into yogurt. The fermentation required a stable, gentle warmth over many hours, a biological process utterly impossible in any other house in Donora, where every neighbor's milk crock had frozen solid and split its ceramic glaze weeks ago. While others fought for survival, the Petkovs were culturing yogurt. The Vindication came on the 5th day of the inversion. Pierce Yardley, a good foreman, despite his rigid certainty, was worried. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see the tops of the company smokestacks, and he knew that meant some of the cabin flues might be choking. A blocked flue in this cold could be a death sentence. Before the morning shift whistle, he began a grim walk down the row of cabins, checking for the telltale sign of life, a steady plume of smoke. He passed the Riley cabin. A frantic, thick, black smoke poured from its pipe. They were burning something they shouldn't be, probably treated wood or tar paper. He passed the Jones cabin. The smoke was thin, wispy, a bad sign. They were running out of fuel. His boots crunched on the frozen, soot-dusted snow. The air he exhaled froze instantly into a cloud of ice crystals. Then he came to the Petkov place, and he stopped dead. There was no smoke. None. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He'd mocked the man, but he hadn't wished him dead. Had the mud finally collapsed? Had they suffocated? He walked to the door, his heart pounding, ready to break it down. As he neared the structure, something felt wrong. The air around the mud pyramid seemed still, less bitingly cold. He reached the south-facing wall, the one that had borne the brunt of his mockery. It was a sheer, smooth face of frozen mud, rising into the toxic gloom. He looked at the cabin next door, the Jones place. Its wooden walls were coated in a thick, 3-inch layer of crystalline frost, sparkling malevolently in the dim light. Every nailhead was a white flower of ice. Yardley, driven by an instinct he didn't understand, pulled off his thick leather glove. His bare hand was instantly assaulted by the 28-degree air. He hesitated for a second, then pressed his palm flat against the burnished clay of Stoyan's wall. He expected a shock of searing cold, the feeling of his skin sticking to a frozen surface. He felt warmth. Not hot, not even truly warm. It was a gentle, dry, life-affirming warmth. It was the temperature of a living thing. He stared at his hand, then at the wall, his mind unable to process the sensory data. This wall, caked in what should be frozen mud, was radiating heat into the deadliest cold he had ever known. He felt the wall of the neighboring cabin. It was like touching a block of solid ice. He stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief. The world he knew, a world of simple, brutal physics, had just been turned upside down. He looked up at the strange, silent pyramid. He finally understood. Stoyan Petkov hadn't built a house to be heated. He had built a hearth. The door opened. Stoyan stood there, dressed in simple trousers and a wool shirt. Behind him, Yardley could see the warm, lamplit interior, the children playing on the floor. He could smell food cooking. Stoyan looked at Yardley's bare hand, then at the wall, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He simply nodded. Yardley couldn't speak for a moment. The foreman, the man of numbers and authority, was speechless. "My God, Petkov, he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "You didn't build a wall. You built a furnace skin." Word of Yardley's conversion spread through the mill faster than gossip. The story of the warm wall became a local legend. After the inversion broke, men would walk up the hill, not to mock, but to ask, to touch the wall for themselves. Stoyan, a man of few words, would simply invite them inside. He never gloated. He shared his knowledge freely, sketching the design in the dirt with a stick, explaining the principle of mass in his halting but clear English. That spring, the Pennsylvania Slavic Brotherhood, a fraternal organization dedicated to helping immigrants from Eastern Europe, sent a representative. He interviewed Stoyan, took meticulous measurements, and listened to the testimony of Pierce Yardley. In their next circular, printed in both English and Bulgarian, was a full-page article titled "A Bulgarian Fortress Against the Pennsylvania Winter." It detailed Stoyan Petkov's cob-coated A-frame with precise specifications for the mix, the thickness of the walls, and the method of application. By the autumn of 1910, the hills around Donora looked different. 7 other Bulgarian steelworker families, empowered by the knowledge and financed by the Brotherhood, had built their own mud pyramids. The landscape was dotted with these strange earthen structures, monuments to shared wisdom. The following winter, while fuel prices soared, the families in the cob houses lived in quiet, steady warmth, their coal consumption cut by over 70%. The technique Stoyan Petkov brought from the plains of Thrace was, in essence, a century ahead of its time. Modern building science now has names for what he did. His structure was a form of direct gain passive solar design, with a massive integrated trombe wall, though his wall was charged by an internal rather than external heat source. The principles of thermal mass, of decoupling heat generation from heat delivery, are now fundamental to high-efficiency construction. But in 1909, in the soot-choked hills of industrial Pennsylvania, it was simply magic born of memory. There is a profound lesson in the silent earthen pyramid that rose among the shanties of Donora. In a world that valued speed and disposability, Stoyan Petkov chose patience and permanence. While others saw mud as a messy nuisance, he saw it as a vessel for heat and a shield against the cold. The innovation wasn't in discovering a new material, but in remembering the deep, ancient potential of the most common material on Earth. He didn't roof his cabin with stone, a material of static strength. He taught the mud to climb the pitch and become a slow-burning second hearth, a quiet, breathing heart of warmth that held his family safe through the darkest winter. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity inspiring, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What modern problem do you think could be solved by looking at an ancient technique? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and building science. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional engineering advice. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.